Hey, everybody. This is a special lesson on laminitis with my sister, Dr. Gretchen Nelsen, veterinarian, and my equine vet, I have to mention. And so we did a podcast on laminitis. And what this is a lesson with some visual elements, looking at some cases of laminitis, some x-rays and what's actually happening, describing different cases, how it can manifest, what happens, that kind of thing. So, Dr. Nelsen, would you like to just tell us quickly what you're going to show us with this lesson on laminitis?
Okay, so the first thing I'll do is just show you some pictures of dissected horse foot that shows the normal versus the kind of chronic laminitic or foundered horse with rotation. And then I'm just going to take you through a few of the cases that I've had and show you variabilities of the rotation, the sinking, and one that we did a deep digital flexor tenotomy on, which is a treatment. When I went through school and graduated in 2002, it was considered a quote unquote salvage procedure. But more and more we're finding that if you, on those horses that are just really rotated and you can't quiet down that lamina, it has actually become a treatment of choice to do preemptively and really try to derotate or dorsally rotate that coffin bone back to where it should be. And you're taking away that tensile force from the deep digital flexor tendon.
And so a tenectomy?
But it's not something that can just be done. Tenectomy, which means cutting of tendon.
And it's the deep
or
digital
desmotomy, some people call it.
Okay. And
Flexor
it's basically severing the flexor tendon, not the deep digital. Or
correct.
No. Okay.
No, the deep digital flexor tendon. You have your superficial digital flexor tendon, your deep digital flexor tendon, and your suspensory tendons all on the back of the leg. The deep digital flexor is the only one that goes all the way down to the coffin bone. The others insert on the pastern bone. And so this is the one that is pulling on the back of that coffin bone and creating the rotation because of those physics forces we discussed in the podcast, where the lamina is trying to hold the bone in place, but it's breaking down due to the inflammation. And that deep digital flexor is just constantly pulling on that coffin bone, and eventually it wins.
Okay.
And pulls the bone into rotation. So this is gonna be a little awkward. I apologize for any shakiness or not lining it up perfectly, but
okay.
I'm behind the times.
It's okay.
So we're gonna turn now and look at my computer screen. Yeah. So how is that?
That's pretty good. Can you go in a little closer?
As far as looking at that. Okay. How's that?
Yeah, it's cutting off the view on the right side a little bit, but maybe go in on each hoof at a time, unless you're comparing them.
Okay. Yep, we can do that. And I'm going to be using my mouse with my left hand, which is a little awkward.
Okay.
But first we're going to look at the first one. So how is that?
Oh, that's good.
This is the normal hoof. Yeah. So here's our normal hoof. We've got the coffin bone right here. And it's got that nice blue line on it showing you the dorsal surface of that coffin bone. This is the dorsal surface of your hoof wall. So you've got the exterior hoof capsule. Here's your white line, that nice, beautiful white line. And here's your lamina. Okay. So it's right there, all this nice red stuff that's between the top of the coffin bone and the white line. Down here, you've got your sole with some nice sole depth, and you can see how the bone is sitting parallel to that sole. Here's the frog that's giving you all the cushion in the back. This is your digital cushion back here, which is kind of cartilaginous. And then right here, this white line coming down is your deep digital flexor tendon.
Oh,
and you can see where it's inserting on the back.
Go in a little closer. Yeah, and then point to the deep digital flexor again.
So it's right here is where it's inserting on the coffin bone.
Okay.
And it comes up right here, running behind the navicular bone.
Okay.
And then the cut just made it a little thin right there, but it extends up behind the pastern bone.
Okay.
So this is a normal hoof.
That's what it's supposed to look like. Okay.
Yeah. So then we come over here to the hoof with chronic laminitis. You can
Ooh.
see the difference here just by the blue lines, the angle change. It's no longer parallel. It's done what we call rotated, where this deep digital flexor tendon right back here
Mhm.
has pulled the bone backwards.
So the
It's
toe is,
also, the toe is now closer to the sole. You can see how much thinner that sole is.
oh yeah.
And also in conjunction to the frog support is now more caudal or further behind the bone and not giving it the cushion that it needs.
Oh,
You've
shift your
also
phone.
got, so your lamina now.
Shift your phone
Sorry.
over a little. There you go. I know you've got the mouse going with one
How's
hand. That's
Yep.
better.
So here's the lamina that's pulled apart, and now the white line has created this laminar wedge. This is all dead, useless tissue that's pushing on this bone even further, making it go back.
So that
And
really
so-
long toe on the hoof is just creating more pressure.
Correct. And so that's why when we do corrective shoeing, we're cutting off this toe.
Mm.
We get rid of that toe. We come over here and pull our heels back
Oops.
where we trim this and
Shift a
Oops,
little to the
sorry,
right.
how's
There
that?
you go. Yep.
there.
There.
Yeah, we want to trim this back part and try to bring this back to try to level this back down.
Mm.
And so that's the purpose of it. And then cutting that deep digital tendon will release the tension on that bone and allow that tip to come back up. But what it also does is destabilizes this joint, the coffin joint right there.
Ah.
And they can luxate it or, dislocate it, or even have what's called a subluxation where it just shifts a little bit. So supportive shoeing is crucial. You cannot do a deep digital flexor tendon without a good supportive shoe. And so this is one of those things where if you're going to commit to a deep digital flexor tendon cutting, you've got to commit to some really good and often expensive farrier work.
They cannot go barefoot
There's a
once you
whole
do
bit
that.
behind it.
Yeah.
Correct. Not until, like, if you get it all stabilized and everything goes good, eventually they may be able to go barefoot. But initially, when you do the cutting, you have to have that supportive shoe. Okay. So now we're going to
And
move
this
on
is
to a couple of
where,
the cases.
especially if we have a farrier that doesn't have experience with laminitis, this is why you want to get your vet and your farrier there at the same time, is because the farrier will be
Correct.
afraid to take that toe back. And you really have to look at the x-rays to help the farrier know where to trim.
Correct. So you can see that x-ray okay? Or do I need to shift?
Nope, that's good.
Okay. So this
Go in a little
is
closer.
that Arabian that I told. How's that?
Yeah, I'm seeing there. That's
Good?
perfect. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the Arabian that I told you about that was pretty subtly laminitic, that we ended up testing all the other Arabs in that household, as it were. But this one presented with a left front lameness that I did what's called a Palmer digital block, where I put lidocaine in at about this level right here. And what that does is block everything to the heels and the back of the sole about halfway down the coffin bone. The horse was still lame. So then I did a higher block that's called an abaxial, where I did it up here by the fetlock. And that blocks everything from about here down. And the horse went sound, but then went lame on the other foot.
So I couldn't see your
he shifted from.
I couldn't see your cursor when you said from here down.
So
when you did the second block,
see the second block was up here at the fetlock. Can you see the cursor now?
No.
How's that?
Oh, okay. It's up high.
Yep, it's up high.
Okay,
it's up here by the fetlock.
We have the 3 bones. Okay.
Yes. And so I blocked up here, and that numbs everything from about right here, the top of the pastern of P1 down. And so that blocked everything down here, and the horse went sound, but then became lame on the right front. So I said, let's do x-rays of both front feet. So, and I was looking at navicular as well as any, abscesses, laminitis, anything like that.
Okay.
So now we're back down here in the foot. And what I'm looking at is he's got pretty good angles here. This doesn't really look like, there might be a little touch of rotation, but the toe's not crazy long. It's a little bit long, but not too bad. The bottom of the coffin bone looks like it's pretty flat. I mean, I might call this a mild rotation, but what is obvious too is this little black area above the bone itself. It's a little bit on the wide side.
Can you zoom in on
So
that?
that's where, and this, yeah. So this little black part down here that's right above the bone is just a little bit wider than we like to see.
Oh, I
It
see
should
that
just
shadow.
be a little bit crisper.
Okay.
Yeah, that black shadow right there should be a little crisper. And the other thing I forgot to mention in the history with this horse is he had increased digital pulses on both front feet.
Okay.
And so the pulses were elevated. And that's where I was like, okay, we got to make sure this is not laminitis. Sorry, I feel like I'm shaking. I need to adjust here. I wish I had something to put the phone on. I have to use two hands for it. So I did that foot, and then we did the right front foot.
No, I think it's helpful to look at x-rays.
Yeah. And so this one also has that little thickening shadow above the foot. And there's just a scotch of rotation. That angle is just slightly changed from that angle.
Right.
But it has a nice thick sole.
Because you can see the outline of the hoof from the outside view, and the bone, P3, the bottom bone, is not quite parallel.
Correct.
Yeah.
So this horse had, but it was negative to hoof testers. It did not show any pain when I did the hoof testers, because classically your laminitic horses will get sensitive when you put the hoof tester down here by the bone. Because especially if they're rotated, it really hurts. And so this horse was negative on hoof testers, blocked sound, and then went lame on the other foot. And so we did also do a navicular shot. So that's its navicular bone, which looks beautiful.
And is that from the bottom or the top when you take the navicular shot? That's from
this shot is from the back. So I'm behind the horse's leg and shooting at a 45-degree angle downward to get this flexor surface. You also see the navicular bone on this shot sideways.
And it's that little
just like in that hoof
bone
cutout we had. Yeah, it kind of looks like the flying nun hat. Or some people say a wooden slipper. You can kind of see it. So right here is the outline of it on that view. And that's a front to back. This horse is well balanced. It's got good sole depth. I'm not seeing any abscesses, but it did respond to decreasing sugar in the diet. I put it on a product called Insulin Wise. We tested it and it was insulin resistant. This horse is now back to showing and doing great barefoot. Like we did we ended up putting it in soft ride boots for about 2 to 3 months and resting it, and got him to the point where he was comfortable barefoot off butte. And now he's back to showing and is going to nationals this next month. And so this was all last year. And then the other thing we do is put him in soft rides for trailer rides. So anytime he goes on the trailer, he gets put in soft ride boots just to help out. And so that one was a good one. This one shows a before and after trim. So this is a 34-year-old Appaloosa with Cushing's, who was a chronic rotator, but he stabilized on the rotation. But this is how the hoof was growing. The owner was having a hard time finding a decent farrier. She finally connected with a new guy. So I went out there and met with him, and we did x-rays to show what he had to work with. So this was before the trim. And you can see how the hoof is angled. So there is some rotation.
Match the bone. Yep.
Right. And they wants to grow that long slipper toe in the front. And you can also see that it's getting a little bit of a slipper toe on the bone itself.
Can you
where
zoom in
it's
on that?
having a lot of, yeah. So right here, you can see that bone is actually getting a little bit of a slipper point to it as well. And that's because it's rotated and there's more percussive forces against it right there. And then the bottom of the bone kind of swoops upward. So, and the heel is kind of getting underrun and pushing forward. And then we've got this long ass toe.
Right.
So, and then this was his left front foot, which is the same thing. This one had a little bit more rotation and that long toe. And you were going to say something?
No, it's just so interesting to see like the shape of the hoof from the outside and what's going on with the bones on the inside.
Right. And this is your classic rotated foot will grow super long toe like this.
Okay.
So then this is after the trim. So that's that left front or right front. And you can see he's nubbed the toe and he actually took off more toe after the trim, but we left the sole, but it did help change those angles a little bit. And he was much more comfortable when he walked off. So after he trimmed them, and then here's that other foot.
So that indentation, go in a little bit closer, but like near the coronet band, just at the top of the pedal bone, the way the hoof is growing, it looks like it's, for what we would see from the outside, is it's indented and then there's kind of a bump at the toe.
Yeah.
And that indentation is probably where you would see rings, like that ringing, or the stress rings, they call it.
Yeah.
And that, is that indicative of laminitis or is that more indicative of rotation with laminitis? When you get those rings and that indentation at the coronet band?
Yeah, the rings can be, because you can get rings with like a fever. You can get rings when you do a big diet change. And so it's not necessarily laminitis, but when you have laminitis, you always have the rings.
Okay.
And so you can have rings without laminitis. That is possible. And then the sinking, you'll actually feel a dip right here. Like this horse is not sunk. Here's the coffin joint and here's the coronary band right here.
Okay.
And that's right where it should be. But if they sink, you'll be able to feel a divot here. But then the common thing with, yeah, and your finger will actually kind of dip below the coronary band. Like you can kind of push it and get below it. And then they often get this bull nose hump just because of the way the foot is growing. And then, like I said, we go from that one and then that one was the opposite foot. And you can see it just kind of leveled it a bit more and took the strain off of it with that toe. And the farrier actually did take a little more toe off after this, but I didn't shoot another x-ray. And he was able to go barefoot, stayed fairly comfortable, but he was, 34 years old in Cushing's. And I think we ended up euthanizing him about 6 or 7 months later, but it wasn't because of foot soreness. It was just, he had some arthritis in his hocks and was having a hard time getting up and down. He wasn't eating well. So it was just one of those things where it was the culmination of events. But this trim did improve him.
Yeah, because you can really see how taking the toe back gives you more depth of sole in both of those before and afters. It just gives a little more cushion under that bone. Right,
because you're changing where it's at. And then this one, he was a 22-year-old Arab that had equine metabolic syndrome and did have rotation. But his biggest issue was sole depth.
Like you can see that the bone's almost on the ground.
Yeah, he just would not grow sole. And he did really well in the soft ride boots and managed to go, I want to say it was about 4 years with this being pretty ugly. But then he did have another episode of laminitis and the owner opted to go ahead and put him down at that point. But for 4 years, we kept him pretty darn comfortable in soft ride boots. And just good trimming of keeping that toe back, putting the heel back, and giving him some comfort in the sole department. Because that one was thin, but his other one is super thin.
So in that x-ray, before you change, the alignment of the P1, 2, and 3 in the joint space between the first 3 bones, it looks like it's somewhat subluxated. Would you say they're lined up properly, or there's an issue now going on in those joints?
No, the issue is that this horse had slight pigeon toed, and I was focused on getting this straight. Therefore, these are I was focused on getting the coffin bone truly lateral. So I've got my joint space here. Therefore, these joints are considered slightly obliqued.
Okay.
And so those are not straight images. You can tell because like these sesamoids back here are not lined up perfectly. And so I was focusing here, but because this horse had angular limb issues where he kind of toed out a little bit, the other joints are not lined up perfectly.
Okay.
But I was focused. I wanted this one to be perfect.
But that's
so
not,
that's where
that's not directly related to the laminitis either. That was just how
no.
Okay.
No, that was just his crooked legs. So, but then he ended up having quite the slipper toe just from years of having that super soft sole or thin sole.
And so can you zoom in
where,
on that a little bit, like the depth of sole and that little extra slipper growth on the bone itself?
Yeah. Can you see it there?
A little closer. There. Yeah. So that little tiny J hook at the front of the coffin bone, because it's so close to the ground, it almost looks like an elf slipper.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's
so
just
created that.
That's just bone creation because of the concussion and because of the rotation.
Yeah. It's bony remodeling in response to forces. And so he's created like a bone callus, basically.
Okay.
Yeah. So think of it like a thick callus, but it's on the bone. And so it's more bone.
And you can really see like that oblique angle of the front of the hoof, and then the angle to the bone inside the hoof is nowhere near parallel. It's not
Correct.
a parallel relationship, which is the ideal.
Right. It's this line versus this line.
Right.
You're going to have more of a trapezoid than a parallelogram.
Yes.
So, and then our final one. All right. So this is the one where we did the tenotomy. Let me get to the before.
Ooh.
Hold on a second.
That's like ballerina point shoes.
Yes. Yeah. So these are like toe shoes. So this is our left front foot. This is before we did the tenotomy. So you can see how incredibly angled that is.
Yeah.
Pointing straight downward. He also has a big abscess right here. That's
and
that
so
black line.
The black line. Okay.
Yeah. So the lines are either fluid or air in the capsule, because on x-rays, air is black, bone and soft and dense things are white. So metal would be the whitest and air would be the blackest. And then all this gray is soft tissue or hoof capsule. And so then when you get these black pockets, it's either air pockets or fluid pockets within it. But the biggest thing is that downward angle of this bone. He's pointed straight down. He also has some arthritis up here, you can see. And it's not a perfect lateral. This is where you're getting the bones kind of oblique slightly.
Okay.
But it was good enough to know what was going on.
And that was something we didn't really talk about on the podcast, but would you consider it sort of in a severe laminitic episode like this one with that bone really rotated, that they call them sterile abscesses, that you get these pockets of gas, air or fluid where the hoof is abscessing because of all the inflammation and the rotation?
Correct. It's considered a sterile abscess because they're created because of necrosis. So because of poor blood flow and the pressure from the inflammation, it's creating a dead area, a necrotic area or dead area where there's no more blood flow.
Right.
And so then it creates this pocket of dead tissue that then needs to be opened and drained and paired out if possible.
Just like a regular abscess.
Yeah. So his was pretty high up, but then, so you can see this is his left front, which was the worst one. the right front. Oh, come on, mouse.
Is that about the worst rotation you've seen? Because the bones are almost lined up straight.
Yeah, yeah. This is severe. I mean, it really couldn't go any further.
Right.
Yeah, there's just no more room for it to grow.
And again,
So,
if we
'cause
look
what's-
at the level of the coronet band with the top of for this amazing amount of rotation, I can't believe that that's still intact. Like it's not sinking. So the coronet band and the top of the coffin bone are still both lined up where they should be.
Right. So so basically that means that he still has blood flow back here at the back part of the foot. And all of this is still maintaining its lamina, but the force is here. This is the dead part. And then the deep digital flexor tendon is back here pulling on it. So it's pulling it away from there, but it's still attached back in here.
Okay.
Where it's still getting some flow.
So
and then
he
this
was one where cutting the tendon was starting to look like the best next option.
Right. Yeah, because there's just no amount of trimming that could fix that foot. And then this is his right front foot, which you can see is also rotated, but not quite as bad.
Almost.
I mean, it's still pretty damn ugly.
Yeah.
And then this one may have just a little sinking, although it seems to have more sole down here. You can see the top of the coronary band right up here.
Isn't
And
quite
that
lined
coffin
up.
joint, it's not quite lined up. So this one has a small degree of sinking. The abscessing is not quite as bad, but there is some there too.
Okay.
So we've got both front feet like this. So then the tendon was cut. And let's see, that's the right. So we'll go from the right front to the right front. Oh, that's the left. Yeah, that's the right, because this is the one with the little bit of sinking there. But now you can see that bone is not quite, now he hasn't taken off all the toe that he will take off. This was more to see how it would go with the shoe setting up. But you can see after cutting that tendon, it didn't snap right back to where it needs to be,
Right.
but it definitely improved the angle.
So it moved the right direction because you took the pressure off of the bottom of the bone by cutting the tendon.
Correct.
Okay.
And so it released the pressure at the back and allowed the bone to come this way. So dorsally rotate or de-rotate.
Right.
And then this coffin joint is holding up pretty well, but there's a little bit of what we would call subluxation where this capsule is moved slightly. So that's where this supportive shoe is so important. And it's going to be more obvious on the other one. So let's go back
and this
to our
one
original.
I can really see in this x-ray why the backward shoes are such a good strategy for laminitis. I think this is where we put the shoe on backwards, taking all the pressure off the toe and giving more sole support with the trailer even behind the heel.
Yeah, I think this one was actually an egg bar.
Oh, was it
and
egg
not
bar?
the reverse shoe? Yeah,
Okay.
because this is blunted back here. So this was an egg bar and set back because ideally you want the front of the shoe to not put any pressure on this area that's so sensitive.
Got it.
And so that's where I think he actually ended up backing it up just a little bit more. But here we're going to go back to our original on the left. Whoops. So that's our left front.
Okay.
When we started, and then we came down and that's our left front after the cutting. So you can see how that bone has shifted, and this is a major luxation. So even with the shoe, this is not stable, and it's mostly because there was no supportive structure on this front. So, and now there's nothing pulling back here. So this coffin bone is kind of free floating, but we at least got it to shift to where the blunt of the pressure was not right here at the toe anymore. It was more dispersed across. So even though this is not pretty and not totally stable, it's stable enough that it allows a dispersion of the forces across the sole more and not putting a ton of pressure right there at the toe.
And what you mean by luxated is that joint space, the coffin joint space, basically that coffin bone is shifted forward a little bit as well as rotated back towards normal.
Right. So this part came back towards normal, but this part up here has shifted, and you can see how that pastern bone, this surface of the P2 should be locked in this little curve of P3.
I can't see where you're pointing.
Oh, can you see it now?
Oh yeah, it's a tiny little dot. There it is. Okay.
So this right here,
That joint
space,
space.
that curve of P2 should be set in the curve of P3.
Mm,
And you can see how this is shifted, and there's all this extra space right here.
right.
So that's what's called a subluxation.
Okay.
And that it's not completely dislocated, but it's out of its normal position.
Okay.
But it provided the relief we needed down here. But that's why if you didn't have this shoe on, this would be flapping in the breeze as much as it could within the hoof capsule.
Right. It would be too mobile.
Yeah.
Yeah. Man, so even with cutting the tendon, it didn't change the angle a lot, but just that much of a change in degree of the angle can increase the comfort factor, reduce the pain factor significantly.
Correct. Okay.
Yeah, because no longer pointing on the toes.
Yeah.
Man, that is a steep angle.
Yes.
And with abscesses, that's because I've heard people say that once you start to get abscesses with the laminitis, it starts to become a much more serious issue.
Right, because it's if you keep getting abscesses, then you're worried about, like, are they throwing little clots in there that's creating the abscess? Is it just there's so much tissue death that it just keeps creating this sloughing abscess? And so oftentimes with those repetitive abscessing, you know that you haven't fixed the problem. You've just kind of put a Band-Aid on it, you're getting it better, and you may increase the comfort level of the horse. But if they just keep doing those repetitive abscesses, then there's something wrong in either the blood flow, or you've got some kind of necrosis in there that's just not resolving.
Yeah, and that's where it can become life-threatening. It just becomes so painful for the horse that they can't get up. They just, and even on heavy doses of medication and pain relief, it's like it just isn't going to touch it.
Yeah, because you just then have to look at quality of life, like how comfortable is this animal, and is it worth putting them through the discomfort? Because sometimes with laminitic cases, you may have a period of a week or two where they're really painful, but then you can kind of get them out of it and get them more comfortable. And so it's like, can you get them comfortable enough with medications to get through the worst of the worst to hopefully get on the road to recovery? But some of them, it's like you may have one good week and then 3 bad weeks, and then a few good days, and then back to some bad days. And so that's where I always tell my clients, just look at the overall picture. And when you start getting, more bad days than good days, then it's looking at the quality of life and what they're going through. And where, when is it time kind of thing.
And so also looking at the relationship of the outer hoof wall to the bone on the inside. If I have a farrier where that toe of the horse is getting longer and longer and the heel is getting underrun, could that start to create pressure, like where the bone and the front of the hoof should be parallel to each other? If they're not parallel and just the trim of the hoof is becoming more of that trapezoid shape, even though the bone hasn't rotated, could it work in reverse where I'm putting pressure on the pedal bone or the coffin bone because the toes are getting too long and the heels are getting too pulled forward? So like a horse that never gets trimmed or gets trimmed very badly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the ones that get trimmed badly or never get trimmed, oftentimes if that bone is where it should be, it depends on their environment, if they can just break the hoof off themselves and whatnot, because that's what wild horses do, is just out in that environment, running on rocks and all that stuff. They're breaking off the hoof as it grows.
Right. And
so a lot of it is environmental.
Well, and if they're barefoot and their bone is in the right place, they should be cracking the hoof and breaking off chunks with what needs to come off. But if you have a shoe on, then it's not going to break off as easily. So if there's a shoe on and it keeps getting a longer and longer toe, could that put pressure where it shouldn't be in the hoof, kind of creating any extra inflammation that otherwise wouldn't be there?
It's possible, but it would have to be, because if there was no other insulting reason for it, like endocrine issues and stuff, then I mean that farrier would really have to be very negligent or really creating a major issue to do that.
Yeah. Sounds like you have a tickle in your throat.
I do. I've got a tickle.
No, take a drink. Okay, so we looked at, and I will post a link to the podcast that we did on laminitis in this lesson video. And in the podcast, I will post a link to this lesson video back and forth, because this is really a follow-up to the podcast on explaining laminitis. We went through all the different causes, what it is, symptoms, first aid treatments, and all of that. So this is just looking at some case studies and what's going on inside that hoof capsule that we don't have x-ray vision. So we need to call the vet to see what it looks like, to know if there's rotation, because you can have pain and inflammation with and without rotation. And there can be various degrees of rotation. So thank you for sharing that with us and for putting your camera up against your computer where we could see the x-rays. A little low tech, but we're not proud.
I know.
So thank you so much, Gretchen. I hope that helps a lot of horse owners, because laminitis is something all horse owners need to learn about and learn that it's not necessarily a death sentence. There's a lot that can be done, but if we can prevent or get early treatment for it, it helps a lot.
Tremendously, yeah.
Yeah, so it's something that all horse owners need to just be aware of and learn a little bit about, because it is a life-threatening thing for a horse. And
Yes.
you know, my farrier explained it. What it feels like is if I slam my thumb in the car door and I get a blood blister underneath my thumbnail. He said that's the closest thing to how we can understand what laminitis feels like in the horse, is if we get a bruise or something underneath our fingernail, there's not a lot of space there, like you said, between the bone, the last bone of the finger and the fingernail. And that pressure, I had my fingernail split one time with a lead rope when a horse pulled back, and I almost fainted from the pain. It was just my fingertip, but the nail got split. And I go, if that's what laminitis feels like, that was like, there's so many nerve endings there that I turned white and I almost fainted from that pain. It was incredible.
Yeah.
And so to have, like, you know, an injury where we lose our fingernail, I go, that's, for us, we're not walking on our fingernails, but for horses, they're walking on their fingernails. They can't get away from that intense throbbing pain. And actually, even the bounding pulses that we can feel on either side of the fetlock is kind of like that ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom feeling we get under our fingernail when we have an injury that creates a little blood pocket or inflammation underneath our fingernail. So that's what our horse is going through. Because they're basically, that coffin bone in the human is the bone that's right underneath our fingernail. So the last joint of our finger is the fetlock, and then the pastern, and then like it's finger.
The last joint is the coffin joint.
The coffin joint.
This would be your coffin joint. This would be your pastern joint. This would be your fetlock.
The knuckle.
Your wrist would be the horse's knee.
Right. The carpus.
Yeah. And so all theirs is much longer than ours.
Right. Right. But there are, like, it's still called phalanges.
Yes.
Finger bones, phalanges. Yes. And so they're basically walking on their fingertips. And if they get inflammation under that fingernail, it's bad.
Yes.
All right, my dear. I'll let you go get a drink. We'll wrap it up.
Thank you.
Clear your throat.
I'm like, I gotta blow my nose.
Okay, thanks everybody for joining us, and we hope you enjoy this lesson on laminitis. Bye.